war in Ukraine has seen millions of lives changed across Europe. The destruction of cities across the country by Russia's military has resulted in the displacement of millions and deaths of thousands of civilians. The conflict, which began as a so-called special military operation, has drawn wide condemnation from many countries around the world.
Please stop war!
So, is there an end in sight for the war in Ukraine? And what are the possible outcomes for President Putin and President Zelensky? Russia's war in Ukraine began in February of 2022, 8 years after the annexation of Crimea, seen at the bottom of this map. Since the start of the war, the fighting has become a territorial battle where both sides are fighting for fine margins of land in and around cities in eastern Ukraine.
There are a lot of very pessimistic outlooks, and it's harder to see a pathway to a genuine, sustainable, negotiated peace. I'm David Lewis. I'm a professor at the University of Exeter. I specialise in Russian foreign policy.
So I think we're almost guaranteed to have quite a messy outcome. I'm Dr. Precious Chatterjee Doody, and I'm a specialist on Russian foreign and security policy, and especially the way that Russia uses information to support its foreign and security policy.
The war in 2023 has seen Ukraine begin its counter-offensive in the hope to push Russian forces out of major cities in the east.
Potentially, if Ukraine makes big advances in this counter-offensive, it could push the scenario where Russia might feel under pressure to do a deal. I think much more likely is that Russia will not want to go to negotiations in a weak position. So in other words, you'll simply have this protracted conflict and it'd be very difficult to get the two sides together.
One possible path to resolution is through diplomatic negotiations. This would involve all parties coming to the table and engaging in sincere dialogue to find common ground. International mediators such as the United Nations and the European Union could play a crucial role in facilitating these discussions.
An additional effort to make the Russian Federation understand that this war is becoming an absolute nightmare, and to create the conditions for the war to be stopped and for serious negotiations to be put in place.
For a diplomatic or political settlement to be reached, trust needs to be established on both sides, something that seems unlikely due to Russia's dishonest actions in the past on the international stage.
And over the past few years, we've got very numerous examples of the Russian political elite and diplomatic corps basically using barefaced lies to hide their international crimes or to hide their culpability for it. But what this does at a really concrete level is it severely limits the international community's ability to oversee any kind of sensible diplomatic resolution, because that level of, fundamental trust, the faith that the rule of law is going to be followed, it just isn't there.
Another stumbling block to diplomatic and political settlements is how a ceasefire will be implemented and whether it provides an opportunity for Russia to regroup and bolster its military.
And a ceasefire now, without a durable solution, would allow President Putin to rest and refit his troops, and then restart the war at a time more advantageous to Russia.
It may be to Russia's advantage to have a ceasefire at some point, simply to allow it to rearm, to regroup, and to get some breathing space. But it's not really to Ukraine's advantage militarily. So you might find that even if there's a proposal on the table, that Kiev will be quite reluctant, I think, to go down that path.
With political settlements and a ceasefire looking unlikely, how possible is further escalation in the war, which could see the involvement of third parties or even the usage of tactical nuclear weapons?
A lot of this will come down to his own personal and regime survival. If he feels under threat, then my own personal view is that all bets are off, and we may see different levels of escalation. It may not include nuclear weapons. There's other ways that Russia can still escalate using conventional weapons. So that would be a first step. Nuclear weapons would be very much a last resort for Moscow, but I think we shouldn't take it off the agenda completely, because the risk is clearly always there.
A further outcome could be the internal toppling of Putin from within the Kremlin, or from public pressure as the war drags on into a protracted conflict that sucks on national resources and the lives of Russians.
There are certainly some segments of oppositional feeling that exist in Russia, but what happens is the Kremlin quite effectively makes examples of a few of them, with quite significant penalties. And this means that people in general get the impression that the costs of speaking out far outweigh the potential benefits. It's just not worth speaking out. And that makes it really difficult to organise actual social movements that might resist Russian aggression. You know, people can't see that there are others there who could give them strength. And that's one of the reasons that this sort of repression can work.
Public discontent with the war is probably manageable for Putin as long as he's in charge and has control of the security forces and above all propaganda. Russian propaganda has been quite effective and quite successful at selling the Russian line to its own people. The more complicated question is about the elites. Again, what we've seen so far is broadly consolidation around the war by most of the elite. But as things drag on, and of course if Russia does suffer a really serious military defeat, then the situation might change. In those sort of circumstances, you might see either a threat to Putin's position from the right, i.e. from nationalist forces who want a more effective military campaign against Ukraine, or you might see more sort of moderate forces saying, well, enough is enough, we now need to rebuild the economy.
Recently, Putin has faced his first test with Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin, marching his mercenary troops towards Moscow to voice his frustration with the way the war was being conducted. Putin, however, dealt with Prigozhin by exiling him to Belarus and stating the Wagner leaders will be brought to justice.
Все, кто сознательно встал на путь предательства, кто готовил вооруженный мятеж, встал на путь шантажа и террористических методов, понесут неименуемое наказание. Ответят и перед законом, и перед нашим народом.
So, with political and diplomatic settlements looking unlikely and a ceasefire being insufficient, what do our experts believe is the most likely outcome?
The most likely outcome at the moment is still some kind of stalemate. Maybe it's quite a dynamic stalemate in which there's still quite a lot of fighting going on. But I'd be very surprised if the Russian forces collapse completely and Ukraine simply rolls them over. So therefore we might be in quite a long war of attrition, one that is very hard to resolve, but is also very hard to stop. So a kind of protracted rolling conflict that is very difficult to see either going into the direction of a negotiated peace or indeed hotting up again into a sort of full-scale war. So I'm afraid at the moment that looks to me like the most likely scenario. Some Ukrainian gains, but probably relapsing into a fairly dynamic stalemate along the front line, perhaps later on in the year.
So I think we're almost guaranteed to have quite a messy outcome. It's highly unlikely that we'll see a complete and clear withdrawal of Russian forces back to, the 1991 border situation. And I think we can expect to see continued social unrest in some of those contested or fought over border regions. So even if we were to reach a sort of frozen situation of conflict or some sort of settlement situation, you have got then the makings for ongoing political unrest that it's possible to maybe capitalise on further in future, so that there's always going to be, I think, a retaining mechanism for Russian influence in those regions.